Imagine this. You're running one of the oldest, richest civilizations on Earth. Your farms feed hundreds of millions. Your workshops produce the finest goods in the world. Your government has been functioning longer than most countries have existed. And then a group of foreign powers shows up at your coast and says something simple. Open your markets, not because you need to, not because it benefits you, but because they do. When you hesitate, they don't negotiate, they blockade your ports, they bombard your cities, they rewrite your laws, and within a few decades, one of the most self-sufficient economies in human history is bleeding wealth, losing control of its trade, and spiraling toward collapse. This isn't theory, this actually happened, and it nearly destroyed China. Now I know what you're thinking. Trade is supposed to make countries richer. That's what we're taught. More markets, more prosperity, everyone wins. But what happened to China in the 1800s wasn't free trade. It was forced trade, and the results were catastrophic. To understand how insane this story really is, we need to rewind to a time when China wasn't weak, wasn't poor, and wasn't falling behind. We're talking about China before the storm. In the early 1800s, the Qing dynasty ruled over one of the most advanced economies on Earth. China wasn't some isolated backwater. It was the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. They produced tea that entire empires depended on. Silk so valuable, it traveled thousands of miles across continents. Porcelain so perfect, Europeans couldn't replicate it for centuries. China didn't just export luxury goods. It had massive agricultural output, skilled labor, complex supply networks, and a bureaucracy that actually worked. While much of Europe was still industrializing, China already had large-scale production, regional specialization, and internal trade on a massive scale. And here's the key part. China didn't need anyone else. Food, produced at home. Textiles, produced at home. Tools, ceramics, metals, medicine, all domestic. From the Chinese perspective, foreign trade wasn't essential. It was optional, nice to have, not necessary. So when Western merchants began arriving in large numbers demanding access to China's markets, the Qing government set strict rules. All foreign trade was limited to one port, Canton. Foreign merchants couldn't travel freely, they couldn't negotiate directly, they couldn't set their own terms. Trade happened through approved Chinese intermediaries, under Chinese control. To China, this was perfectly logical. Why open your entire economy to outsiders when you already have everything you need? Why risk instability for goods you don't even want? But to Britain and other Western powers, this was a nightmare. Because while China didn't need Western goods, the West desperately needed China's. British society ran on Chinese tea. European elites craved Chinese silk. Porcelain filled royal palaces, and every shipment had to be paid for in silver. Pure silver. That meant year after year, enormous amounts of Western wealth flowed into China. By the early 1800s, millions of ounces of silver were leaving Britain annually. This wasn't a small trade imbalance, it was a national crisis. Silver was money. It backed currencies, it funded governments, and China was absorbing it at an incredible pace. From Britain's point of view, trade with China wasn't enriching them. It was draining them. They were buying everything, selling almost nothing. A one-way flow of wealth, and it couldn't continue. So Britain faced a problem every empire eventually faces. How do you force open a market that doesn't want you? They tried diplomacy. China refused. They tried better products. China didn't care. They tried pressure. China held firm because China didn't need Western trade. But Britain needed China's. And that imbalance is what set everything in motion. This is where trade stopped being about exchange and became about control. Western leaders weren't looking for mutual benefit anymore. They were looking for leverage, a way to reverse the silver drain, a way to break China's economic independence, a way to force the doors open, and soon they found it. Not through better products, not through negotiation, but by turning trade itself into a weapon, because once you can control what flows into a country and what flows out, you don't just influence its economy, you can reshape it. In the next part, you'll see how Western powers engineered a trade system that flipped China's wealth outward, hollowed out its economy, and transformed one of the world's strongest civilizations into a target for exploitation, and how what was sold as free trade became one of the most destructive economic strategies in history. Once Western leaders realized China wouldn't open its economy voluntarily, the entire mindset shifted. This was no longer about selling goods. It was about breaking resistance. Because if China stayed self-sufficient, the West would stay dependent. And empires don't tolerate dependence. Britain, in particular, was watching its silver reserves drain year after year. Every ship that returned from Canton carried tea, silk, and porcelain, and left behind piles of precious metal. To the British government, this wasn't trade. It was economic bleeding, and bleeding eventually leads to collapse. So officials inside the East India Company and Parliament began searching for something economists today would call a reversal asset. A product that China would buy in massive quantities. A product that would flip the silver flow back toward Britain. Something addictive, repeatable, and impossible to replace. That's when they looked across their empire, to India. Britain controlled vast territories there, including fertile regions where poppies had been grown for centuries. From those poppies came opium, not as medicine, not as tradition, but as a commodity. A commodity Britain could industrialize. The East India Company transformed opium production into a factory system. Farmers were pushed to grow poppies instead of food. Harvests were standardized, output skyrocketed. Opium was compressed into dense bricks, packed into chests, and shipped by the tens of thousands. But here's the important part. China had already banned opium. Officials knew it destroyed productivity. Families collapsed under addiction. Silver disappeared as people paid for the drug. So Britain couldn't openly sell it. Instead, they built a smuggling network so large it functioned like a shadow trade empire. British ships anchored offshore. Middlemen ferried opium into coastal ports. Chinese dealers distributed it inland. And Britain pretended it wasn't involved. On paper, private traders were responsible. In reality, the entire supply chain was designed, funded, and protected by British power. This wasn't an accident of commerce, it was policy. And it worked. Within decades, opium flooded Chinese society. From merchants to soldiers to government clerks, addiction spread everywhere. But the real transformation wasn't social. It was financial. Silver started flowing out of China in enormous volumes. The same silver that once poured in for tea was now leaving for opium. Trade had flipped. Britain wasn't losing wealth anymore. It was extracting it. By the 1830s, millions of pounds of silver were draining from China annually, and that had devastating consequences. Because silver wasn't just money. It was the backbone of China's tax system. Peasants paid taxes in silver. Officials were paid in silver. Government budgets ran on silver. As silver disappeared, everything broke. Taxes became harder to collect. Prices distorted. Government revenue collapsed. The state weakened. And a weak state can't maintain order. This is where forced trade crossed from economic pressure into systemic destruction. Britain didn't just sell a product. It undermined China's monetary system. And once a country loses control of its money flows, everything else follows. Chinese leaders saw the disaster unfolding in real time. Officials warned the emperor that the nation was being hollowed out. Addiction was destroying the workforce. Silver was vanishing. Social stability was unraveling. So the government tried to stop it. They banned opium again and again. They arrested smugglers. They shut down dens. But every crackdown ran into the same problem. The supply never stopped. British ships kept arriving. More opium kept flowing. Because the trade wasn't driven by small criminals, it was backed by imperial power. And when China finally decided to enforce its laws seriously, when officials began confiscating massive opium stockpiles and threatening traffickers, Britain didn't see it as law enforcement. They saw it as interference with trade. British merchants demanded protection. Diplomats complained of lost property. Politicians in London framed the situation as China violating the principles of commerce, not poisoning millions, not draining an economy, just disrupting trade. That language mattered, because once trade became the moral shield, military force became acceptable. China wasn't defending its people anymore. It was obstructing free markets. And in the logic of empire, that made China the aggressor. This is the moment where trade stopped being economic policy and became justification for war. Because if a country can be invaded for interfering with profitable commerce, then markets aren't voluntary. They're enforced. And enforcement was about to arrive at China's shores. In the next phase of this story, Western powers would turn naval guns into economic tools, bombard ports into compliance, and rewrite China's sovereignty through treaties signed at cannon range. What began as a trade imbalance was about to become a full-scale dismantling of a civilization's control over its own economy. Once Britain decided that protecting trade profits justified force, the outcome was never in doubt. China was still operating on a pre-industrial military system. Britain had become the world's most advanced naval power. Steam-driven warships, modern artillery, professional armies hardened by decades of imperial conquest. What followed wasn't really a war in the traditional sense. It was economic enforcement by firepower. British fleets sailed along China's coastline with total freedom. Ports that resisted were bombarded. Harbors were blockaded. Trade routes were cut. Chinese defenses, built for earlier centuries, simply couldn't respond. Wooden ships faced iron hulls. Short-range cannons faced long-range artillery. Entire coastal cities were forced into submission, without Britain needing to hold territory for long. The message was simple: open your markets, or we will destroy them. Every time China tried to assert control over its trade, another port was shelled. Every time officials resisted foreign merchants, another blockade tightened. Commerce was no longer negotiation, it was compliance under threat. Eventually, the Qing government had no choice. Facing collapsing defenses, strangled trade, and growing internal chaos, Chinese officials agreed to terms. But these weren't trade agreements. They were economic surrenders. Under the treaties forced on China, the old system of controlled commerce was dismantled. Multiple ports were thrown open to Western merchants. Foreign traders could operate freely. Chinese authorities lost the ability to regulate who sold what, and on what terms. Tariffs were fixed at low levels, often dictated by foreign powers, meaning China couldn't protect its own industries. Imports flooded in. Domestic producers were undercut. Wealth flowed outward. And perhaps most damaging of all, foreign nationals inside China were placed beyond Chinese law. If a British merchant broke local rules, Chinese courts couldn't touch them. They answered only to their own governments. This created economic zones inside China where sovereignty simply didn't exist. Western traders operated with total protection. Chinese officials watched from the sidelines. The trade system that had once kept China stable and self-reliant was dismantled in a matter of years. And the flow of wealth accelerated. Not just silver now. Profits from imports, shipping revenues, financial control of ports. China had become a marketplace without control, open in theory, extractive in reality. And once the gates were forced open, every major Western power rushed in. Britain was followed by France, then Germany, then Russia, then the United States. Each demanded its own ports, its own privileges, its own economic access. China wasn't negotiating, it was being carved, piece by piece. Every new treaty weakened the government further. Every concession reduced revenue. Every loss of control deepened instability. Meanwhile, opium continued flooding in, now increasingly tolerated and eventually legalized under foreign pressure. The same trade system that had once drained Britain's silver was now draining China's economy in every direction. Addiction destroyed productivity. Imports crushed domestic industries. Foreign companies dominated shipping and finance. And the government, stripped of revenue and authority, struggled to function. Rebellions began erupting across the country. Peasant uprisings fueled by poverty. Regional revolts against weak central rule. Millions would die in internal conflicts that the Qing state no longer had the strength to prevent. Trade had done more than open markets. It had hollowed out the system that held the country together. And here's the critical point most history classes skip. This wasn't just bad policy, it was predictable. When a nation loses control of its money flows, its tariffs, its legal authority, and its production base all at once, collapse isn't surprising. It's structural. China wasn't falling because it resisted modernity. It was collapsing because its economic independence was forcibly removed. The same tools that built Western empires were being used to dismantle one of the world's oldest civilizations. And the world was watching it happen. Some benefited. Some competed for a bigger share. Almost no one intervened. By the late 1800s, China was no longer a sovereign economic power. It was a fragmented marketplace controlled by foreign interests. Ports run by outsiders. Trade dictated by treaties. Wealth flowing outward. Government authority weakened beyond repair. What had started as a trade imbalance had become systemic domination, and the consequences would last for generations. But the damage didn't stop with economics, because once a country loses economic control, political collapse isn't far behind, and that collapse would reshape China's entire future. By the turn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. The civilization that had once dictated the terms of global commerce was now trapped inside an economic system it didn't control. Foreign powers dominated ports. Western companies controlled shipping. Tariffs were fixed to favor outsiders. Silver and profits flowed outward year after year. And the Chinese government, stripped of revenue and authority, could barely hold the country together. The social consequences were devastating. Widespread addiction weakened the workforce. Cheap imports destroyed local crafts and industries. Farmers fell into poverty as markets collapsed. Tax collection broke down as silver disappeared from circulation. The state, once one of the most organized on earth, became chronically underfunded and unstable. This economic unraveling fueled massive internal rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion alone killed tens of millions of people. Regional warlords carved up territory. Central authority crumbled. China was no longer merely losing trade power, it was losing cohesion as a nation. And while internal chaos consumed the country, foreign powers continued tightening their grip. New concessions were demanded, more ports were opened, more privileges were granted. The pattern repeated over and over: pressure, submission, extraction. Trade had become the mechanism of domination. By the early 1900s, China existed in what historians later called the century of humiliation. Not because it failed to modernize, but because its economic independence had been systematically dismantled. The Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1912. 2,000 years of imperial rule came to an end. What replaced it was a fractured republic plagued by instability, foreign interference, and economic weakness. The wounds left by forced trade didn't heal quickly. They shaped generations. They influenced revolutions. They hardened attitudes toward foreign power. And they created a deep national memory of what happens when a country loses control of its markets. This is why trade isn't viewed in China today as a neutral force. It's remembered as a weapon, a tool once used to drain wealth, undermine sovereignty, and break a civilization from the inside. When modern Chinese leaders talk about economic independence, supply chains, and control over strategic industries, they aren't speaking in abstract theory. They're responding to lived history. A period when open markets meant foreign domination, when free trade arrived backed by warships, and when prosperity for outsiders meant collapse for the country itself. The West didn't nearly destroy China with bombs alone. It did it by reshaping how China traded, by forcing open markets that had once been optional, by reversing wealth flows, by stripping away economic sovereignty piece by piece. Trade wasn't just exchange, it became leverage, and leverage became control. Once that control was established, everything else followed: political weakness, social breakdown, foreign domination. This story matters because it explains something many people misunderstand today: China's caution toward globalization, its obsession with manufacturing, its push for self-reliance, its fear of dependency. These aren't paranoia. They're historical lessons. Lessons learned when trade was turned into a tool of collapse, when a self-sufficient civilization was forced into an extractive global system and nearly didn't survive it. China eventually rebuilt. It industrialized. It regained sovereignty. It pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty. But the memory of how close it came to destruction never disappeared, and it continues to shape how the country interacts with the world today. So when people talk about trade as automatically beneficial, automatically fair, automatically peaceful, China's history offers a different perspective. Trade can create prosperity, but when it's forced, weaponized, and enforced by power, it can also dismantle nations. The story of China in the 19th century isn't just about the past, it's a warning. About what happens when economic systems stop being voluntary, about how markets can become instruments of domination, and about why sovereignty over trade is as important as sovereignty over borders. That's how the West nearly destroyed China with trade, not through simple exchange, but through control. If this story gave you a new perspective on history and global economics, share your thoughts below. These moments from the past still shape the world we live in today more than most people realize. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that quietly reshape civilizations.